I hope y'all are ready. It may have been the global day of jihad, Friday the 13th, but we have this from Reuters. U.S. must be ready for simultaneous wars with China and Russia, report says. The U.S. must prepare for possible wars with Russia and China by expanding its conventional forces, strengthening alliances, and enhancing its nuclear weapon modernization program, a congressionally appointed bipartisan panel said on Thursday. The report from the Strategic Posture Commission comes amid tensions with China over Taiwan and other issues and worsening frictions with Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. Another thing that many people have brought up to us that came up yesterday was something called the Samson option. Considering the conflict with what's going on with Israel, I think it's particularly relevant to this story. For those that aren't familiar, the Samson option is the name that some military analysts and authors have given to Israel's deterrence strategy of massive retaliation with nuclear weapons as a last resort against a country whose military has invaded and or destroyed much of Israel. Commentators also have employed the term to refer to situations where non-nuclear, non-Israeli actors have threatened conventional weapons retaliation, such as Yasser Arafat. Now, what's interesting about that concept of the Samson option, the general idea being, so we have this convoy of Hamas storming in, killing civilians. Israel then starts targeting Hamas bases and weapons depots and things like this. Civilians get caught in the crossfire. They die. We then get fake videos. There was a fake video today, apparently, of Qatar saying that they were going to cut off gas supply. Not real. It's been debunked, my understanding. But you have threats from Iran. You have Lindsey Graham saying war with Iran. If there is an invasion of Israel, the fear is that they're just going to say, we refuse to be destroyed, and they'll fire a nuke at their enemy. But I think the reality is any country with a nuclear weapon that is invaded and is facing extinction or non-existence is going to launch a nuclear weapon. So the fear here is Israel being particularly vulnerable. If they launch a nuke, then what happens? I mean, it's going to be all out World War III, massive nuclear warfare.
Yeah.
I mean, when I think about it, the Samson option was essentially the core of what in the Cold War we called mutually assured destruction. Because mutually assured destruction is the United States has 10,000 nuclear warheads and the Soviet Union has 10,000 nuclear warheads. And the reason you have peace is each side makes a public declaration that if the other side launches nukes, you will do the same and cause essentially the extinction of mankind. And it's that mutual fear, oddly enough, that keeps both parties reasonably well behaved. Now we're in a post-Cold War era, of course, but I don't see why that logic disappears. It remains actually identical, except now it has to be applied, more regionally or more locally. But why would a country allow its own extinction without wanting to visit exactly the same on the people who perpetrated that? I mean, this is a case where, I suppose at a certain theoretical level, you could have, well, listen, they've already launched these nukes. I'm going to die anyway. Why should I kill more people? I just need to sit tight and let myself be blown up. But that's not realistic. No one really thinks like that.
Yeah, I don't know. I've never been through nuclear war, but it's not just like the nuke hits and then that's the end. Like a nuke will set up the stage for an invasion. Like you can level the ground, level all the defensive capabilities, and then invade the city that got nuked like 2 days later or something, or a day later.
Well, also there's fallout. There's all sorts of things that happen afterwards that also suck. If you don't die immediately, it's almost worse.
Radiation and all
48
kinds
hours of fallout or something. The Chinese, are they actually genetically altering their soldiers to be radiation resistant? We talked about that.
There was a report that they've started breeding genetic super soldiers. I mean, that's a scary reality of what's to come. And so I suppose the concern is not even nuclear weapons. I think that's old school thinking. Honestly, it is actually crazy to me that most people to this day are like, nuclear weapons. I'm like, bro, that's 100 years old, basically. Like they started developing this stuff 100 years ago.
Yep.
Deployed a couple, by today's standards, weak ones. That's kind of scary to think too.
Yeah.
And then really, since the 70s, we've had ICBMs and MIRVs and things like this. The U.S. 10 years ago funded a very, very small megaton gravity bomb. Basically, pocket-sized version of the Fat Man. And we also have these ICBMs, we have hypersonics. But I think people need to understand that a lot of the research has been in targeted biological weapons. And the real scary thought is not that Israel says, we're going to fire a nuke, but that they're like, we're going to unleash a virus or something like that.
Or like an insect plague. I think that people have been using insects also.
I mean, let's think about this realistically. You've got ethnic conflict in the Middle East. Right? These are groups that hate each other based on their ethnic heritage. Wouldn't they be specifically trying to target, if you've got groups of people saying that they want to eradicate Israel, would they not make weapons specifically to do so?
If they had the capabilities, they probably would.
I do believe that it's more about territory and less about genetics at the core. I think it's about who owns that area of the world.
Well, right. But what I'm saying is the majority of the people in Israel are Jewish, and many of these people in, say, Iran or in Gaza, Lebanon, explicitly say the Jewish people. And so it's not even about that. I mean, isn't there, on all sides, when it comes to any kind of war, if the U.S. is facing war with Russia, there is an incentive. This is war, man. I mean, you look at what was that Japanese unit in World War II?
731, I think.
731. 731.
Yeah.
They stuck people's arms into sub-zero temperatures. They're in a room and they put their arm into a vat or whatever with sub-zero temperatures, and then pull it out and shatter it with a hammer to see what would happen.
Yeah.
Then after the war, the U.S. is like, we need those guys over here.
Well, it's
like the
great
depravity of this
stuff. We did, because they were sending like plague fleas and hot air balloons over here. I think one actually landed.
Well, they were doing those
somewhere.
bombs.
Yeah.
They had the hot air balloons. What are they called?
I don't know if
We
there's an
talked
actual
about
name.
it.
Yeah, we did.
And they would float in the jet stream.
Yep.
And then once they would start sinking, once they got too low, then a bag would drop and it would go back up. Crazy. And then it would start dropping bombs.
Yep.
I mean, we just get a small insight into how nuts these people are just when we think about gain-of-function research. Yeah. I mean, just think of something so explosive as to take highly contagious viruses and start screwing with them to make them more lethal, to, quote, study them. And this is going on in laboratories all over the world. And the probability of these viruses getting out, when you add up all the laboratories and all the procedures, is actually pretty high. Yeah. So it ends up that you create a worse plague than you started out to try to diffuse. And all of this is all in peacetime. And now you put in war and the aggression and the competitiveness of war and the massive resources devoted to the military, which is much bigger than the resources available to the NIH. Yeah. And you can only imagine what scary stuff is going on there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and honestly, it's beyond just biological weapons or directed energy weapons. When the U.S., during the Manhattan Project, nobody knew what they were doing. There was speculation that the U.S. was working on some kind of technology, and some of the speculation was a laser beam, a death ray, and some people I believe did speculate that there was going to be a nuclear bomb. I think it was because the initial publications of nuclear reactions, quantum mechanics, and things like that was like 20 some odd years earlier. So the U.S. started working on this and theoretically saying, like, can we make this explode? Can we blow it up big? Yeah. And so people were trying to figure out what it was. Right now, but no one knew. That's my point. Right now, the weapons the U.S. has are probably beyond our comprehension, right? Or I shouldn't say beyond our comprehension. I mean, like we'd be like, oh, wow, they did what? It's just that if I'll put it this way, I bet they could come out and be like, yes, the large, international, multinational, military-industrial complex corporations have a weapon that is based on, X. You'd be like, wow, I never thought of that.
I might say that the weapons that are being used now are beyond our perception. That might be an interesting way to look at it, because like lasers, you don't see them. They're just heat. It's just heat that you can't see.
What I mean is, like, we're not even thinking of what they've already developed. So we're talking about like biological weapons, and they're like, that was 20 years ago.
Molecular disassembly through vibration. I mean,
exactly.
People's skin just fall off just by hitting them with a low frequency, stuff like that.
Or just like renders you not able to think at all.
Look at the was it the Havana syndrome?
Yeah, Havana syndrome.
They thought that was a weapon. I guess they're saying it's not now. Yeah. But people would hear like a loud hum, and then they would start losing vision in one eye and getting headaches, and they couldn't think straight.
I mean, interestingly, with every major war, the magnitude, the scale, the horrific nature of it was completely unanticipated before the war. I mean, World War I, nobody had any idea that it would last as long. That trench warfare, you'd have people who are basically fighting for 2.5 years for like 50 yards of land. And you're sitting in a trench knee deep in water, you sleep there. People are being shot up and their bodies then just dissolve right next to you. And so just the sheer horror of it. And the thing about it is we haven't had that kind of a war now in all of our lifetimes, because we have to go back to World War II for a comprehensive war. So it makes people, in a sense, lose sight of what war actually means.
The first World War was the machine gun. No one anticipated the machine gun. So they'd get up with their rifles and run towards what was assumedly dudes with rifles, as they had done for hundreds of years. And then the machine gun changed that. And then World War II, you have air power. Like the force of an air bomber changes in everything. And
But
now
this
what do we
is-
have? We have space lasers. Who knows what we got?
This is the story. Well, yeah, China does have space lasers. Not say they're weaponized, but we know for a fact that story.
You could
where they
drop
were
stuff from orbit readily. It's just getting
it up there, right? But what you're describing, Ian, is the story of basically every war, right? So we've talked about Gettysburg. The Confederates were using muzzle-loaded rifled muskets, and the Union had adopted breech-loading rifles with cartridges. So the Union is firing every 10 seconds, and the Confederates are firing every 30 seconds to a minute.
Napoleon,
No question.
I don't know if Napoleon had new tech other than like if the Dutch tech that the Dutch didn't have or tech that the Austrians didn't have or whatever, but he invented the corps system, the corps, the corps, military corps, where he'd divide command amongst his generals and give all of his marshals, basically they were called, total enough authority amongst themselves. And so they were able to move much more rapidly and respond to battlefield activity much more fluently.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, there's a very interesting study of Western civilization which tries to understand how the West became the dominant world power, which it has been over the past 500 years. And the argument was that the Western countries were always fighting, and as a result, each side had to keep innovating in terms of warfare to get the edge over the other guy. Whereas you think of take American Indian societies, for example. Now, there was tribal warfare and so on, but it was conducted kind of the same way. Whereas what was happening in the West is one guy, you start off and you have a normal cavalry, then one guy starts inventing a crossbow, and the other guy has to develop a shield, and then the knights start putting on armor. And so there's constant innovation that shows why the power in the West keeps moving. I mean, it belongs to the Portuguese. In fact, that's how the Portuguese got to India. They were the leading power in the West at one time. Then the Spanish, then the French, then the English. Hitler's actually basic point was he was kind of envious of the fact that the British and the French had sort of dominated the world in the previous 100 years. He's like, what about the Germans? So a lot of Hitler's aggression was motivated by that. He actually admired the British Empire. He wanted to create one.
Well, with Europe, you have a peninsula, and with expanding population density, the Mediterranean is warm weather, so there was more abundant food. It was easier to grow food. You end up with people with more free time. Then you get population density with close proximity and conflict over resources once winter starts rolling in. So you have all this fighting. Because exactly as you described, you get innovation. There was one story I read where, I can't remember what battle it was, but one side made their arrows with very tiny notches so that when they fired the arrow towards the enemy could not put the knock or whatever it's called, the notch or knock or whatever it's called, into the string, and they couldn't fire it back. But theirs, with the larger hole, they could pick up, so they could use both arrows, but one side pulling, like that kind of innovation. Here's the thing about North America. Sparsely populated. When Native Americans would fight, it would be brutal, but they could also flee. So we see this in natural selection as well. It's why birds are less likely to be aggressive because they can just leave. Flight, and in the sense of like avoiding a fight, not in the literal sense. Right. Avoiding a fight takes less energy than engaging in a fight. So burrowing animals tend to be more vicious, and flying animals tend to be less vicious for that reason. Right. It's not absolute, right? Rabbits are not particularly vicious. You back them in a corner, they might nip at you, but
gophers might
their strategy was just to have lots of themselves, which is kind of funny. True. Or their evolutionary pressure.
And they didn't have armor. The Native Americans, as far as I know, I don't think that they focused much on. They didn't build castles. They didn't build defensive bastions. They didn't really, that I know of, build armor and things like protective, because it was always like attack and retreat, attack and flee, attack and run away.
It's such a massive landmass with tremendous farmland in the Great Plains that you didn't have to have such dramatic fighting over resources, and effectively you could leave. If they were chased out and the land was taken by a warring tribe, they would run away.
And they didn't, I don't know, I assume that they didn't farm not as readily as they did in Europe. They were more hunter-gatherers.
Well, you had two types. You had the sedentary farming tribes and the Hopi, the Pueblo, but of course they were always at the mercy of the Comanche and the Apache and the nomadic, more vicious, tomahawk-carrying tribes, which would have their way with these other. I mean, Columbus noticed this when he got here. He the first Indians that he ran into were really nice guys, and Columbus went back to he went back to Spain, and he's like, these people are they're like Adam and Eve. They're like living in the Garden of Eden. The second time he came back, he ran into a whole different crew, and And in fact,
yeah.
a lot of the allegations against Columbus, Columbus turned vicious and so on.
against
Well, the
that.
reason he turned vicious is he ran into tribes that were into mass slaughter, and that opened his eyes.
Thanks for watching this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast. Hang out with us live Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. and become a member over at timcast.com for uncensored, members-only shows exclusive. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all next time.